Hey everybody, it's Mr. Herzl again coming at you with another review. So this is week 5, Middle and Southern Colonies, and possibly your teacher could have sent you here for, maybe this isn't a review for you, maybe this is your first time finding out the information. That's cool, we're going to cover it all. If it's a review, you're going to know everything by the end of this. So either way, you're all good. But this lecture, we're going to learn about the Middle and the Southern Colonies. So we've already talked about Massachusetts and Virginia and some of those things, and so we're going to talk about the other colonies now. So let's go ahead and get started. This week's TEACS, remember, this is what the state of Texas wants you to know, so it's really important that you pay attention to these specific things. So they want you to identify reasons for European exploration, which we're going to talk about with the Dutch as well as the Swedish, and then describe religious reasons for the establishment of colonies versus other colonies' political and economic reasons. So the Middle colonies and the Southern colonies have a mix of both religious and economic reasons for settling. And then explain the role of significant individuals such as William Penn in the development of self-government. So obviously William Penn is going to be the guy who founds Pennsylvania, so we're going to talk about him as well. So if you want to kind of understand what we're talking about when we talk about the mid and lower colonies, the middle and lower colonies, I can put my pointer on here. Let's see if I can pull it up. Here we go. Laser pointer. All right. So you have like the middle colonies are right here in Virginia. Or I mean, sorry. Right here in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. This area here, Delaware. And then you have your southern colonies. So Virginia is considered a southern colony, but we kind of cover it first because we've already we talked about it first because it was the first colony founded. So we've already covered it, but it is a southern colony. And then you have North Carolina, South Carolina, and then what becomes Georgia. And there's not Florida yet. We're going to get to that later. That's all controlled by the Spanish. So if you want to know what we're talking about when we say middle colonies, it's right here. Okay, and then southern colonies, it's right here. And so that will help you understand kind of middle colonies geographically what we're talking about. Virginia and northeastern colonies. You know, you can look at this here and kind of figure out a little bit about that. But really, when you talk about the middle colonies, they are, the biggest difference originally is that they're not British. And so we're going to talk about that on the next slide, and then how they become British. So the first middle colony was New Netherlands. It was created by the Dutch West India Company, and actually it wasn't just the Dutch. The Swedish actually came over as well, and they founded a place called New Sweden, but eventually the Dutch were just more successful. So if you want to look at the area, again, the area that the Dutch are going to come into and take over is smack dab in the middle of, you know, it's above Virginia and it's below Massachusetts. Now, what kind of problem does that pose for the English? Well, that poses a big problem if you've got another entire government that has land in between two of your colonies. You know, it's not good. I mean, it's not like the Dutch and the English are at war during that time, but eventually they could be, and there are issues that are warlike that lead to problems and eventually lead to England basically taking it over, which we'll talk about in just a second. So, but originally it's the Dutch that control New York, what will become New Jersey, and Maryland, that area. So the first middle colony, we talked about that. So it's New Netherlands, and to attract settlers, what they did was they basically accepted a lot of different people. to their colonies, and it was really all about trade. So when you think about New Netherlands, really you're thinking about, it's kind of like the Pilgrims when they originally went to the Netherlands. They went there for religious, the ability to be religiously free and not have to worry about being persecuted, because you could believe whatever you wanted if you lived in the Netherlands. And so, you know, if you think about that and that religious freedom, then you're going to understand that their new colonies are going to be much the same way. So they're going to attract a lot of people that are coming over because of that. And it's not necessarily religious people, but most of them are going to be traders. They're going to be involved in the fur trade. They're going to be involved in shipping. Yeah, a lot of really, really successful merchants. So obviously Britain's not going to like the fact that, you know, up here you have New England, and then you have, you know, down here you have Virginia, and then smack dab in the middle you have this area that's controlled by another government. So they don't like that, and so they're going to basically come in and take it over. So basically in 1664, as a part of a larger war against the Dutch, remember I said they weren't originally at war with them, but eventually they do go to war with them. And as a part of that war, the English and the Dutch are at war with each other. They basically come in, the English come in and take over the area that we now think of as the Middle Colonies. So it's going to become English very quickly. So when you think about it, just think, hey, it was founded by the Dutch, which, remember, it's very confusing, but the Dutch, and when you say Dutch and the Netherlands, it's the same thing. So it's founded by the Dutch, but then it's taken over by the English. And they are going to, Charles II, who's the King of England during that time, he orders his navy to attack New Netherlands, and the Netherlands peacefully surrender. Most of the Dutch, though, that were living there just stayed, and they just stayed under the new English rule. So Charles II appoints his brother, who is named James, and he has a title. He's the Duke of York. And so they're going to call the area what is now called New York, right? So that's what they're going to call it, New York. And that's how we get what we now know as New York. In 1665, that individual, James, who had been given New York, he becomes the king, and he declares New York a royal colony. So he's going to basically say, okay, you know, this is what I owned this property, but I'm giving it back to the crown, which meant that he was giving it to himself because he was now the king. So by 1700, the colony had about 20,000 people living there. Okay, so they're going to seize the colony from the Dutch and obviously rename it New York. And so as we move from New York to Pennsylvania, we're going to see some very different things in terms of why these two places were founded. New York is founded for the same reasons that you have that the Netherlands came in and founded it, you know? So the Netherlands come in, the British come in and take it from the Netherlands, and it's still very profitable for trade. But Pennsylvania is different. So, you know, Pennsylvania is going to be about William Penn and his religion. So let's talk about that. Okay, so one of the most important middle colonies was Pennsylvania, which was founded by William Penn in 1681. And it's an interesting story. Charles II, who was the King of England during that time, he owed a large debt. He owed a bunch of money to William Penn's father, for it was a political debt that he owed. And so instead of paying him money, he gave his son this large area of land, which we now know as Pennsylvania. And William Penn he had converted, which meant that he had become a part of a religion called the Society of Friends, which we now know as Quakers. They're Quakers. So like if you ever see the Quaker Oats guy on your oatmeal, Quakers, I don't know what that has to do with anything, but it looks like this guy here on the cover of that oatmeal, the Quaker Oats. But the Quakers was a religion, and so they believed in a lot of things that the Church of England really didn't like. And some of those things were they were pacifists. So being a pacifist means that you don't believe in violence in any way, shape, or form. You will not participate in any kind of violence, which means that you won't fight in an army. You won't support an army with your tax money. You won't give money to the government. You won't even pay your taxes, because your taxes might go towards violence and an army. And so in England, Quakers were disliked and they were persecuted, much like some of the other religious people that came to America, like the Pilgrims. And so these Quakers were persecuted, and William Penn had become a Quaker, and he knew that they needed a place to go. And so he wanted to create a refuge or a place for those Quakers to go where they wouldn't be persecuted. And he called it his holy experiment. Penn called it his holy, William Penn called Pennsylvania his holy experiment, and he wanted to promote religious tolerance and religious freedom. So instead of saying, hey, if you come here you have to be a Quaker, William Penn said, instead of being like the Puritans, so in Massachusetts, the Puritans are saying to everyone, if you come here, you have to follow the Puritan rules and be a Puritan, or at least follow our rules and be on your way to possibly becoming a church member. But at the very minimum, you have to do what our church says that you have to do, even if you're not a church member. Instead of that, William Penn says, hey, let's have a holy experiment and just kind of let anybody in. No matter what religion, no matter what they believe, let's just have open freedom. His attitude was, hey, God gives people the ability to choose what they believe, so why should we limit that? And so William Penn is really looked at as the founding father of religious freedom inside of the colonies, which will obviously become America. And so as America, we kind of look to him as our heritage when it comes to religious freedom. Okay, so he's going to also create a government that guarantees political liberties and allows people from all Christian denominations to vote and hold office. And so to him, religious freedom was a little bit different than we might think. So it's not like, hey, we're going to let all these different religions in. His was like, when you talk about religion back then, there weren't very many other religions than Christianity, but they believed that each different kind of Christianity, like if you were a Lutheran, or if you were a Church of England, or if you were a Quaker, all of those they considered different types of religions. And so he didn't care, right? And he said, anybody who believes in whatever, it doesn't matter, you can come here. And he wanted his government to allow for anyone who, anybody basically, to be able to vote that was a man. And it sounds bad that only men could vote, and that is bad. It wasn't good. But for the time, again, this was like really revolutionary to let everyone vote, because usually in these societies, they only let people that owned land vote. And the thought process behind that was that people who owned land had more of a stake in the community. They were more, I guess, we would say now they got skin in the game. So they had something that was valuable in the community that if they lost would be, would cost them a lot. And so they would have more of a desire to make the community better. That was kind of the thought process back then. But he didn't care. He said anybody can come in and vote. And again, that's another foundation for what we have now. So it's for us, it's really important that we look at history and we say, you know, yeah, they didn't do it right. They didn't let everybody vote. But you know what? They were making steps towards what we believe today. And those are the people that started those steps and the general progression to what we have today, where everyone can vote. So he's going to also encourage Germans and Dutch to settle, and he advertised in those countries, and he sold land for really inexpensive amounts of money, and basically lots of those people came. So Germans came to Pennsylvania in large numbers, and you know, they were trying to escape religious and just violence inside of Germany, because Germany wasn't like a country back then. It's not actually a country. Even up past the Civil War, it's not a country yet. It's actually just kind of a bunch of different what we would consider states that ran themselves, and they fought each other all the time. And so there's a lot of violence in Germany, and so a lot of those people came. And people, you know, there was a lot of, they wanted to come and live in a peaceful place. And Pennsylvania was a great place to come and live, because Pennsylvania was also at peace with the native population in their land. So they didn't have, you know, they lived at peace with the population of Native Americans, and they also didn't, you know, they bought land from natives if they needed to purchase land. So it was a peaceful place to live, and that attracted a lot of people from Germany. So I'm going to move to this slide, but I want to tell you something else. We see Maryland here, and it's Maryland. Basically, the way that it came about was on the lower Delaware River. There were people who were Swedish and Dutch who had lived there for a long time, and so they were actually a part of. Delaware. So they were a part of William Penn's Pennsylvania, his colony, but they were originally there when the Dutch came. And so they weren't really like integrated into that society, and they wouldn't give up their land. So they kind of went back and forth, and there was some violence back and forth with William Penn's Pennsylvania. And, you know, because William Penn actually owned that land by decree of the crown, but those people had been living there for a long time. So there was, but finally William Penn, you know, being the person that he is, and of course he's all about peace and harmony. So he just gives it to those people that live there, and that's what we now know as Delaware. Okay, so when you look at Delaware here, Delaware is like connected to Pennsylvania. And so he just says, okay, you guys can kind of have your own, you can have your own space there separate from my colony. So the middle colonies had two of the best ports for trade in America, and we talked about why people came to New York originally as the Dutch, and then the British took over. Well, no matter what, New York and Pennsylvania are going to be great places for trade. And so while Pennsylvania, obviously people came there for religious freedom and for peace and harmony, it was also a very lucrative place, which means that they could make a lot of money. That's what lucrative means. So really, really good ports. And then you can see the population shoot up in those areas, and Philadelphia really just goes through the roof as you move towards 1775. All right, so let's now talk about the lower South, and we're going to talk about South Carolina. So we've already learned about Virginia, and really we're going to just kind of talk about the Carolinas as a one. We won't necessarily talk about North and South Carolina, but just think about the Carolinas. They kind of come about, the Carolinas come about as one block, and then they get split up. So you can kind of think of it as one, until a little bit later, and then it'll get split up, and we can think about it as North Carolina and South Carolina like it is today. So when we talk about the lower South, though, we're gonna harken back to what we were talking about when we talked about Virginia. So Virginia, again, is a southern colony. It's all about growing, cash crops, and so you're going to have a lot of the same kinds of economic activity there that you have in Virginia. So the lower South colonies were the last British colonies to be formed, and that's important. So we're moving along and even getting into the 1700s here, and that's kind of the time frame we're going to be talking about when we talk about the Carolinas and we start to talk about Georgia. So the Carolinas were they had originally, they were Spanish, like in the 1500s, and then they were taken over by the French, and well, they were claimed by the Spanish, and then they were claimed by the French, which means they were claimed, but nobody really lived there. They say they were left to the Native Americans, which means that somebody just showed up and said, hey, we're from France, we own this. And England is the first to really come in and set down roots. And the way that happens is just overflow from Virginia. So Virginia is becoming populated, and people that are poor end up, they're poor and they can't own land in Virginia, or they can't own large portions of land, because you have to remember, these people are growing cash crops, and so you have to grow a certain amount, a large amount, to be profitable. And so if someone's poor and they can't own a large plot of property, well, they're going to move on to whatever's near that's not already claimed, and that's the Carolinas. So the Carolinas is really there's a lot of problems in the Carolinas originally with things like there's no government there in the Carolinas, and this is like from 1700 to 1729. There's no government that's really in control of anything. People just do what they want. There's no law and order. There's a lot of violence on the frontier, a lot of Native American and settler violence against each other, and then violence just between settlers. So because there's no rule of law. And so eventually what happens is the Crown of England comes in 1729. So I said that prior to 1729, we can think of it as the Carolinas, right? And that's quite a ways after Virginia settled, a long time after Virginia settled. And so, the Virginia settled in the early 1600s. And so when we're talking about 1729, we're talking about, 100 years or more after that. And so, but eventually England says we have to take this over, and we have to get control of it. And so England basically takes control of the Carolinas, and they split the Carolinas into two. They split it into North Carolina and South Carolina. All right, and so North Carolina, again, those settlers are poor, and basically they kind of, even after England comes in and sets up North and South Carolina with governments, these people push back, and it is the frontier. When you think about the frontier, the Wild West later on, what we'll think of the Wild West, people just kind of doing whatever they want, and there's no law and order. That's kind of how North Carolina was, and kind of the way that South Carolina was, although South Carolina will become a little bit more it'll be a little bit more better governed. So South Carolina, a lot of people were coming from Barbados. So not as many people from Virginia, but people from Barbados, who, which is an island in the Caribbean. And so those people from Barbados, they were people who they couldn't get any land in Barbados, so they moved to South Carolina, the frontier, and they settled there. So they brought their African slaves with them, and that's how we get a lot of slavery in that area of the South. And so, because Barbados was overcrowded, Barbados was taken over by the Spanish, in the late 1500s. And So there have been sugar plantations there since then, and so it is completely built out and overcrowded, and so those people have to move, and they move to South Carolina. And so you already have generations of people who have owned slaves, and slaves who have been, their families have been owned for generations, and so they end up in South Carolina and become a staple of that community and of that colony, and how that colony makes their money. So they're super successful. Those people are super successful trading with Native Americans. So South Carolina it becomes more friendly with the natives, and there was a huge market in Indian slaves as well. And so these people would not only have their own slaves, but the Native Americans would take captives, and they would, they'd go fight another Indian tribe. They'd take them captive, and then they would bring those captives as slaves and sell them to the settlers in South Carolina. And then the South Carolinians would actually, go and raid. They'd go down into Florida, and they'd go overthrow certain tribes there, and then they would sell those people that they captured to Native Americans in South Carolina. So there was a huge slave trade that was Indians that were being sold back and forth, which kept their cash crop market going as well, and supplemented the African slave trade. So super interesting things when it comes to South Carolina. So let's move on to Georgia. Georgia is really interesting. In 1732, so around the same time that England basically split North and South Carolina, that was 1729. But 1732, Parliament authorized a new colony called Georgia. And the reason why is because if you look at what is Georgia here, this is owned by Spain, right? And so this is becoming more built out, South Carolina, North Carolina, and this is like really populated up here. And all of this is becoming much, much more populated by that time, around the 1730s. And so what England says is, we need like a buffer, we need a barrier between Spanish Florida and English colonies here. And so they come up with the idea to put in place Georgia. And originally their idea was to take people who owed debts, and instead of sending them to jail, they would send them to Georgia. So back then, if you owed a debt and you couldn't pay it, you had to go to jail. We don't do that anymore, but back then they had debtor's prison, which meant if you owed someone money and you couldn't pay it, you had to go to jail. So those people were, filling up the jails in England, and the idea was, we can take those people and put them in Georgia. And so this guy, James Oglethorpe, was one of the 20 individuals who England gave control of the Georgia colony to. And he kind of took the bull by the horns, and he took control of the situation. And although he was only one of 20 people who kind of owned it and could run it, he moved there and started to buy up large portions of property. So everyone kind of sees James Oglethorpe as the creator or the founder of Georgia, which he really was. But eventually his plans really failed. He wanted, what's really interesting is that Georgia becomes a slave state, slave colony, and then eventually a slave state, and then fights in the Civil War. But the people who founded Georgia, especially James Oglethorpe, thought that slavery was the worst thing that could ever happen. And so he thought, his idea was, listen, if we have slaves, what that means is that we have slaves in massive plantations that are owned by rich people. And that goes against the heart of what we wanted to do in Georgia. What he wanted to do in Georgia was have people who didn't have a lot of money and actually owed money come and be given property, and them to work their property and subsistence farm, which means that they would make enough for themselves, and they would have a living just by growing their own crops. And so he thought the plantation system and having slaves totally goes against that. And the second thing that he hated about slavery was it was completely inhumane. He said that slavery made made slave owners lazy, which is probably, I mean, obviously that's true. They're not doing the work anymore. They're having other people do it that they claim they own until those people die. So he looked at it and said, this is a terrible practice and we don't need it in Georgia. But his plans are going to fail. Unfortunately, his plans failed. And the reason why is because people from this area in South Carolina started to move into Georgia, and people from Virginia that couldn't get any land now in North Carolina thought, well, what's the next frontier here? And the next frontier was Georgia, and so they said, hey, well, we got to move there. And so that's what they did, and they pressured the government to basically allow slavery. And so they and the other thing was that the ban on slavery that they had prior to that, they couldn't get anyone to settle there. Nobody wanted to settle because they couldn't make money. And so finally the government gave in, and in 1744 they lifted the ban on 1750, I'm sorry, they lifted the ban on slavery. And in 1752, they gave, instead of those 20 people owning it, they gave it back over to the crown. So it became an official colony owned by England in 1750. So basically everything that James Oglethorpe had wanted to do kind of failed. So in addition to the 13 colonies now that England had, they also had taken over from Spain different colonies in the Caribbean. So they had colonies like Barbados and Jamaica, which we just talked about Barbados and those people from Barbados moving into South Carolina. So the reason why those places were profitable was because of sugar cane, and so they were sugar producing places, and that's how also slavery was well ingrained in those societies because they needed large amounts of labor to produce to process sugar cane. And so what happens is that influences the colonies, in some of the colonies in North America. Although I want you to understand, it's really important to understand, there are colonies that slavery never infiltrates. So Massachusetts is one of them. Slavery never goes there. And the reason why is because the Puritans believed that slavery was absolutely terrible. And throughout American history, Massachusetts will be a colony that protects slaves. They take them in, they hide runaway slaves, they give them different identities, they give them jobs when they run away from the South. And so slavery doesn't come into all of the colonies, but it does seep into the southern colonies, which have economies that are much like these cash crop economies in the Caribbean Sea. All right, y'all, that's all I have. Hopefully this helped you. You're definitely going to be able to take the test after you've listened to this whole review, and you'll be able to ace it. So hopefully that helps, and good luck on the test. Until next time, we'll see you.